Useless Monster by Mute Crows. Chapter 21, or Chapter 20. Izuku sat silently in his seat the next morning and tried to hide how horribly jumpy he felt. It would be more accurate to say he was absolutely blowing the whole attempt, especially with his frustration and how his luck stayed perpetually out of his favor. He wondered offhandedly if it would be absurd to try and find the second-year cat who had given him that miraculous charm. Yuka, I think. Or it was Fuzin. He let out a strained breath. It wasn't like he had any direct way to find out where they were anyways. He shook his head a little, only to nearly leap out of his skin when Bakago sat just as silently as he had been in front of him. No acknowledgement, no huff of breath, not even his usual heavy footfalls that typically alerted Izuku to his approach. He didn't like it. He had hoped he would have shifted last night, but he had no luck with whatever alleged blessing that had gotten him stuck in this position in the first place. All he had wanted was a night to recover from said shift before just going to look. Just a look, that's it. Aizawa's offer had no other possible outcome than just being flat out disastrous. He couldn't just show up and live in a hero's home. Two heroes, if his understanding of Aizawa's and Mike's relationship was correct. He could feel the way the rest of the class was practically side-eyeing him due to his riled energy. It was the most space he had taken up since the school year had started. The nervous jitters seemed to spread to a few others in the room, but they had a much better handle on it than he did. His mind was spinning circles and his base thought was to run. Izuku wouldn't be running though. He had already missed too much of his classes with how he had been sent out yesterday. It was a relief that no actual questions came his way, though. The class as a whole seemed to have decided to just talk amongst themselves and leave Izuku out of it for the day. A number of them had to have picked up on how differently he had been behaving since USJ. He just hoped it wasn't because Tsuyu had told them about what she had seen him do. The staff seemed to be doing much of the same. They all clearly watched him, a few with more intensity than others, and he didn't think it made him feel worse. It definitely didn't make him feel better. If he was being critical of his emotions, he could probably claim to be strangely angry. It was like he was just some kind of show for others to see as they pleased now that the cat was out of the bag. He hated it. He hated it! But he wouldn't bring up as much. It was something he brought onto himself by shifting at USJ. Izuku was the one to put the spotlight on himself, and he was just reaping what he had sown. Something he had to come to terms with quickly as each class passed and he packed his notes neatly and closely together, fitting as much as he legibly could to each page. Notebooks were precious material after. When the bell rings for lunch, he stands with the rest of the class, even as he tries to hide the wince because it just felt so loud. He didn't plan on eating his bento right now. It was going to be saved for later. It was the last night of the cycle, after all. It would absolutely happen tonight. He had a small amount of extra cash, though, today, so he was going to splurge and buy lunch. The lady he had painted a room for yesterday after school had been incredibly generous, praising his ethic being so strong already at such a young age. He had extra. That's what he told himself over and over, at least. He couldn't risk crashing after tonight and missing Friday. It is just a little throwaway. It's extra, and it's okay to eat. He gripped his backpack straps a little tighter as he could feel the way his head thumped softly with tension. It's okay to eat. In the halls, he pulled up short, sharply stopping when a hand appeared in front of him, not touching, just gearing to get his attention. He glanced at it quickly, heart hammering with surprise and relief that it wasn't actually touching him, before looking up to the face of Tsuyu. Her head was tilted slightly, and he could see the clear, cautious curiosity there.
You're overwhelmed,
she stated it as an absolute, and Izuku felt that his face twisted in confusion at the words.
My little brother gets sensory overload sometimes. I have learned to see when someone is getting to that point,
she riveted softly, much quieter than her typical trail-offs that he has heard slip into her words many times by now. He looked away and saw the few glances in his direction from some of his classmates who were close enough still. It almost made him bristle when Tsuyu continued.
Are you okay, Gero?
She was the first to actually ask him today, but he knew that it was what nearly everyone else in class had been wondering too. It was exhausting to feel the weight of multiple gazes resting on him for the whole day so far. He almost brushed her off out of some stupid desire to show that he's absolutely fine. Yet, he caught her eyes and saw the nerves there. She was nervous. He made her nervous now. Of course he did. Tsuyu saw him in his much more horrific and monstrous form, and yet she was trying to still be there. She was asking if he was okay. It made his chest hurt. He gave her a pathetic excuse of a smile and shook his head just slightly. He wanted to try and be honest. She already knew at this point anyways. Tsuyu apparently had not expected the honest answer, as she looked a little surprised. Her gaze drifts in a slight circle around him before she goes back to meeting his eyes, her tongue having slipped a little past her lip while she thought.
Is it?
She brought a hand up as she trailed off, and for a moment Izuku tensed slightly, only to watch her make a sweeping gesture back over her own head. Oh, my antenna. If he wasn't so sure of the fact that it couldn't partially shift in any way, he would have reached up to check them. He almost felt a laugh build at the attempt to suddenly bring up something that was already hard to talk about, even when there was nothing to worry about. Oh, He ran a hand through his own hair as he looked towards the entrance to the cafeteria. Yeah, it is. He didn't look to see her reaction, though, afraid of what it may be, as he continued quickly. Don't worry about it, though. I'll be fine. This isn't new. Actually, sorry for... For what? For scaring her? For showing her I'm a monster because I was scared? He sighed and just let his shoulders sag a little. Just sorry, I guess. Have a good lunch to you. He quickly stepped around her and into the cafeteria proper before she could even respond. He searched the crowd and quickly found Uraraka and Ida and slipped into line right between them. They practically cheered at his presence in the actual lunch line, Ida setting off into a proper lecture about the importance of a filling and varied diet to promote health and growth. When he got to the window, Lunch Rush paused only for a moment before he leaned and pulled the paper down from a tack, then set about making something before Izuku could even speak. If this was unusual, Ida said nothing as he stood behind him, and Uraraka just bounced slightly from side to side as she waited with her food. The table they sat at was smallish, but he felt he wasn't really one to judge, since he wasn't the most adept on cafeteria standards. Shinzo was already eating at the end of the booth side of the table. He didn't think it was the one they had been using originally, but with how Uraraka led the way confidently over, he assumed it was the current table of choice. He slid into the booth with Shinzo, and the other two took seats across from them. It felt somewhat uncomfortable, but he quietly dismissed it as just his own nerves. He hoped. He glanced up from the food in front of him to see Kirishima lingering near Bakugo. It made his stomach turn to think that maybe Bakugo would somehow manage to entice Kirishima into his new group of friends. He didn't get to focus on it long, though, as Tsuyu slid into the booth on his other side. She greeted the others when they welcomed her and quietly ate her meal. I don't understand. He almost asked what she was doing before he realized how strange the question would sound to the rest of the table. So Izuku looked at his rather small-looking meal and set to silently eat. He wasn't that hungry anyways. The conversation was far from lacking, especially when Mina joined the table. She sat down next to Uraraka and boisterously brought up the news coverage on the attack at USJ and all the chatter in the trains and buses about it too. The back and forth about the topic made Tsuyu's quiet presence that much more pressing to Izuku. He was about to excuse himself when Shinzo scoffed loudly at some comment he missed. People just want to gossip. It's all they ever want to do, especially when they don't have the full story. Makes them feel like they've got something interesting going on when they really don't. I don't even listen to them half the time anymore, and with how we were, actually there, even less of a reason to care what the busybody on the bus thinks of something they heard fourth hand. He pushed his tray to the side and leaned forward, getting more invested into the discussion. Izuku didn't even hear what Ida said back as he repeated the words back in his head. It was unexpectedly comforting to hear, and he carried it through the rest of the school day. His mind was unabashedly elsewhere for every class after lunch, and when the school day did finally end, He let himself slip into the familiar, quick mental weighing of the pros and cons of his different options. He grabbed his bento out of his bag and waited for the classroom to empty. It didn't take long. Izuku carefully untied the cloth around the bento, used it to wrap the chopsticks, and tucked both into his bag. A quick glance around to be sure that everyone was out and the door was shut, and he set his bag under Aizawa's podium, pressing it to where it was fully hidden. He didn't want to lose it tonight. He wanted to run. It had been broiling restlessly under his skin all day, and he loathed to admit how much he was wanting to just breathe the way that only his monstrous self could. Hopefully the staff would leave his bag alone if one of them did find it. He held his bento close as he quickly stepped out of the room, intent in his movement but hesitant on his choice. His heart felt too big to fit in his chest, and every pulse felt like it would interrupt his next breath. It had been 9 nights since his last shift, so this had to be it. It had to be tonight. He didn't know what he would do if his change at USJ was not the only thing to change, and his only constant was disrupted as well. Every 7 to 10 days, like a clock with a shot wire. He hoped tonight would at least be a short one. In a garden a few hours' walk from school, he sat and quickly ate his meal. The sun set uncaringly and steadily. Sometimes he envied the way that nature could just continue, irrespective of the chaos or serenity within it. When he felt his grip slipping, he set the box itself under the bench, guilt eating at him about his abandonment of something that was perfectly usable. He would buy another one when he got the chance to replace it. Yagi already had spent so much on him, he could afford to skip a meal or two to afford a replacement. Although it may be left alone until morning and he could come back for it. That would be a nice turn of events for the night. He ducked into the thick clustering of trees behind him and sat in a space that would probably only just fit him. It felt reasonable to be a little nervous about how this shift may turn out, and yet he could almost call it a relief in the same breath. He closed his eyes and sighed. When he opened them again, his muzzle was smooth. He rolled his jaw experimentally and found it still in one piece. Barely a moment to sit, and his anxieties for the day started to press on his nerves once more. The only hope he had going into this was that the shift would be brief. He stood, shook out his feathers, and breathed in as deep as he could through his vents. At least the weather is nice. Izuku leaned into each of his legs experimentally. When none of them gave any protest to his weight, he stepped out of the trees. He started at a trot, then a steady loping gait. The stretch of his muscles made the frantic buzz fade a little. He broke into a full run, his antenna pressed flat back so that he wouldn't have to hear the wind as aggressively, flat enough that he wouldn't have to hear if someone actually saw him flip past either. When he reached the edge of the garden, he leapt across the street, catching himself halfway up the building that stood there. He could feel the way someone must have bumped their head at the impact, probably having jumped in surprise. It was reckless what he was doing, but he couldn't find it in him to feel the care. Everything in him said, run, run, run! Maybe if he had something to actually run from, he wouldn't feel so paranoid. If he had a justification, he wouldn't feel so lost. If he had anything, he could just simply be. He glanced at where the moon sat to the east and ran in the other direction. There was the constant thrum of aches and pains clustered in the more populated areas, and he grabbed at the edges of them, taking a small amount of each with him as he went. He heard the distant sirens of some police call and veered just so to try and put in the extra distance between them both. A number of times he had to slow and wait for an area to clear of more people before he made any attempt to continue. There was a large national park with forests and mountainsides that he wanted to get to. It was his safest option, especially with how police and heroes alike will undoubtedly be looking for him after the attack. The amount of disruption he caused to get there was of little concern in the back of his mind. He just wanted to be away. A surprised shout came from behind him as he dipped over the edge of a building. The door's groaning hinge had given him only the slightest of warnings to dive down before he was seen directly. Izuku pushed it out of his mind as he continued on his journey. He hadn't been in proper woods in a while, and the park was somewhere with fond memories, as sparse as they had been. Maybe he would feel safer there, if only a little. He hoped. The stretch of his limbs, the coiled bend of his body that urged him farther and farther. The tingling feeling of his own skin, as if he was occupying more space than he should be able to fit into, as if he had weight holding him down from every direction. Even as he ran, and the city fell to suburbs, fell to hills, and soon the slope of a mountain, the drag of each deep breath through his vents was a reminder that he could still go. He wasn't trapped. He could leave. He slowed quickly to a stumbled and jolted halt. The only thing that disturbed the night's version of silence was the labored breaths he took. Each one felt like a theft just as much as it felt like a miracle in and of itself. His claws dug into the dirt, and he turned to look at the distant light from the city in the sky. I could leave. It felt so simple in that moment. He could just keep running. He could take his own person and go. He could just go. The breeze picked up a moment, and the soft scent of just the forest around him felt like an ice pack on his too hot mind. A quick check of trying to grasp at his form gave him nothing. He still had time to waste. The choice to continue into the mountain brush was easy. There was a spot he had in mind that he wished to reach before the moon hit its peak. It would be empty this time of night. The detour around the few buildings this far into the mountains was minimal, and he was looking for a specific pain to lift, the kind that always just made him feel like he was doing what others couldn't, that he was doing something important. The climb to the pullout that overlooked the small town and its hospital that sat in the valley below was gratifying in the way it made his muscles ache with their usage. It was a belated realization that he may not find what he was looking for in such a small hospital, but that didn't mean he couldn't pull on the pain of others while he was here. Izuku sat low to the ground, legs tucked so that he could quickly descend if the need arose. The gentle way he allowed his quirk to press its limits to reach the hospital was familiar. A slow tilting of water onto a coin, watching the water tension hold and spread smoothly. There was the ache of old bones, many scrapes and bruises on all ages, a few breaks and fractures within the town itself, and a fresh one being attended to within the hospital's walls. Moreover, it was the surprise of finding the pain he had been looking for. He knew that if he had told anyone that this was something he did, that he searched for specific types of pain to settle, that he would get a response he would much rather not have to handle. The thing was, though, as he pressed his antenna far forward and tried to hear the cries even from the distance he was at, that this was a redemption. This was an absolution that only he could achieve for himself. The draw to it was something he held with the same tenderness that would soon be found in the valley. The wait was patient, and distantly he wondered about Nezu's declaration of his kind, that Izuku was the result of the blessing of gods long ago. He wondered if that was what drew him to this specific kind of thing, or if it was something more deeply rooted in his personal being. The moon traveled steadily across the stars. There. The burning sensation of searching for air and not finding it. The dizzying ache of muscles searching for oxygen it so desperately needed, but as of yet had not had to find on its own. He pulled it quickly. The chafing scrape of his throat felt as though it was closing, even as it stayed clear and unblocked, and the burn in his lungs made the air feel sweeter. And then it was gone. Izuku stood and took the breath he had never lost, eyes skimming across the valley. He laid his antenna back and reached for his grasp, as if this attempt to justify his own existence was the key to being allowed to walk among the city streets without having to be hiding at every moment. The glide of his grip failing to take hold was an unsurprising but bitter reminder of this superstition being just that. He did not do this often, but it was an attempt. He would just have to start heading back to the city. The moon was halfway through its descent regardless. It had been hours. It was exhausting to have to go through such a long night, but he had no say in the matter. If he wanted to be at the very least near the city before it got bright out, he would have to move fast. The phantom of the blockage that never was made Izuku divert to breathing solely through his vents. Each drag left the soft sound of steady breaths hanging in the air. The drop into the valley was steep, but he could afford to allow the large dragging tracks just down the side of the hill, as long as he let the trail die before he got too close to the edge of the mountain range. If anything in particular had been of note on his run back towards the city, he didn't even notice it in the first place. His mind was now running circles now that his body was thoroughly pushed into a near-liquid soreness. Thoughts that admittedly left him afraid and skittish once more. He could feel his grip coming back to him, and, if he was right in his estimate, he had maybe an hour or so of nighttime left. His mental timer was counting down to something that he was terrified to face. The prospect of a home. A home that was not with his mom.